My first principle for a different way of understanding and using the Bible, the whole Bible, rather than just the bits of it that we like, whilst ignoring the parts that we find embarrassing, was to understand that it's a library, a collection of books rather than one single book. Books that were written and influenced by a huge number of contributors over the course of at least 1,500 years. I said that first, this means that for all their extraordinary consensus, they also contain some conflicting and even occasionally contradictory voices and views. Voices and views that reflect, at least in part, the moral consciousness of the individual writers, which, to put it mildly, don't always match up to the ethics or the values of Jesus. Second, I said, this means that between them, these books chart the long discussion between God, who inspired, initiated and pushed the conversation forward, and men and women created in his image. And third, it means that these books reveal the all too often partial, but at the same time gradually expanding human understanding of the character of God and what it is to be human, which we only ever see through the life and death, the example and teaching of Jesus. I think that to understand the Bible in this way, besides being intellectually honest, is an enormous relief. At last, things begin to make sense. So now, my second key principle. To take the Bible seriously is not always the same thing as taking it literally. It's not just the different opinions and worldviews of the books of the Bible. The Bible's also written in various literary styles and genres. Everything from history to poetry, parables to pastoral letters, and from legal code to prophetic visions. For instance, did you know that in Genesis there are two different creation stories? And that not only do they tell different stories, they also contradict one another. For instance, over the order of the creation itself. Read them through to discover where. I promise you, it won't take long. And did you know that neither of them is written as a scientific text or a historical narrative? Instead, we now know that their purpose was to respond to other creation stories already circulating in the ancient Near East at the time. Genesis' first story, which is contained in Genesis 1 through to chapter 2 verse 3, talks, for instance, about 6 days of creation and daylight before the creation of the sun or any of the stars. It's actually a Hebrew poem of thanks and praise, which was designed for public reading, complete with repeated communal refrains which would have been said by all the assembled people. We know by looking at its structure and its dating that it was very probably written to subvert the claims made by the extremely violent, hierarchical, sexist, nationalist and dehumanizing story of the Babylonians, the superpower of the day, which was very popular in the culture of the time. Genesis deliberately contradicts this story time after time, and perhaps most subversively teaches that there's only one God, that God is good, and that each and every human being is created by and is appointed as a divine representative, not just those who are rich and powerful. In fact, here we are in the 21st century, and most of the world, if we're honest, has still not come to terms with its radical message of inclusion and equality. Now, I think that knowing just this adds huge depth of meaning, relevance and power to the Genesis story, not to mention removing the unnecessary and misguided clash with science. It also accounts for the differences between it and Genesis 2, which once again was written in a different style to subvert another well-known Babylonian and Mesopotamian myth. In fact, it's a little like one of the parables that Jesus told. It's packed with meaning and truth, but it's not history as such. By the way, the hard history doesn't start in Genesis until the story of Abraham and his family. So my question is, Why don't we teach this stuff to our children and young people, for instance, on Sundays in our churches, and then perhaps encourage them to watch a sunset together and write their own creation poems and stories of thanks and praise? I reckon that this move on its own would save the faith of many of them as they reach their teenage years. Or what about Noah and his ark? How did he collect all those animals from around the world? How did he get them all on board? How did he feed them once they were there? How did he stop them killing each other, or him, or his wife, or family in the process? Was the whole of humanity really rebuilt from Mr. and Mrs. Noah and their 3 sons and wives? The questions just keep on coming. But guess what? Noah's story is taken from another ancient poem. It's called the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story of a king called Gilgamesh who embarks on a huge, dangerous journey which takes him to the far end of the earth, where he meets the only man who with his family has survived a worldwide flood in an ark. The similarities, right down to the sending out of birds from the boat in search of dry land, are absolutely extraordinary. But the story in Genesis, written long after the Gilgamesh story became well known, not only has the names changed, but once again it subverts the whole thing to make some stunning points that brought meaning, hope and purpose to all of its first hearers. Are any of these Genesis stories historical narratives? The answer, no. Are any of these stories true? The answer, all of them. What they have to teach us is far more important than mere history will ever be. And now, a question for you. Why do you think that we don't take the Bible seriously enough to teach it well? Enjoy the discussion. See you next week.